Picture this: a throne room drowning in the glow of candlelight, heavy with the perfume of sandalwood and the whisper of crimson curtains. At its center, on a dais carved from dragon-shaped marble, sat an ancient woman, 75 years old, her powdered face a death mask of porcelain white, her eyes dark as obsidian, commanding and cold. Rings of emerald and jade glimmered on her twisted fingers, their weight as oppressive as the crown she had placed upon her own head. At her feet knelt two young men, their beauty so otherworldly they looked less like courtiers and more like fallen angels. Their skin was pale as ivory, smooth as lacquered porcelain. Their lips were painted crimson, and silk robes clung to their bodies like mist. One bent forward, trembling, to massage the swollen ankles of the empress, while the other fed her grapes soaked in spiced wine, never daring to meet her gaze. This was no brothel. This was the forbidden palace of the Tang dynasty. And this woman, this frail, powdered figure, was no mere consort. She was Wu Zetian, the only female emperor in 3,000 years of Chinese civilization. To some, she was a mother of reform, a ruler who expanded the empire's wealth and power beyond imagination. To others, she was a monster, a woman who used her lovers like weapons, who drank power like wine, who built her empire on blood and betrayal. How did she rise from obscurity, from the daughter of a merchant, to command the mightiest throne in Asia? How did she persuade a patriarchal empire, one that believed a woman's highest duty was silence and obedience, to kneel before her as though she were a god? The answer is written in shadows, in secrets whispered behind golden screens, in the sound of silk torn in the dark, and in the soft cry of a baby that would never be heard again. For Wu's path to power began not with glory, but with death. A death so small, so fragile, that it could fit in her arms. The death of her own daughter, a sacrifice that would crown her empress and stain her hands forever. But to understand how an infant's breath could topple an empress, we must travel back 60 years earlier, to a palace courtyard where hundreds of trembling girls stood in silence, awaiting their fate beneath the unblinking eyes of an aging emperor. Among them, a girl of 14, not the most beautiful, not the most graceful, but in her gaze burned something far more dangerous than beauty, an ambition like molten iron, a hunger sharp enough to cut through dynasties. Her name was Wu, and the empire had no idea what storm had just entered its gates. The year was 638. The Tang dynasty ruled from Chang'an, the richest and most dazzling capital in the known world. Its streets overflowed with merchants from India, Persia, and Byzantium. Camels carried spices, silks, and glass from thousands of miles away. But behind the glittering walls of the imperial palace, life for women was something altogether different. A silent competition of beauty, obedience, and survival. Hundreds of girls had been summoned, lined up in a courtyard beneath the shadow of dragon-carved pillars. They were little more than offerings, waiting to be chosen, or discarded, for the emperor's harem. Most trembled, eyes cast down, praying to remain invisible. Some prayed for selection, believing even one night with the Son of Heaven could raise their families to glory. But others, the unlucky ones, knew too well that being chosen might mean a lifetime of isolation, jealousy, and danger. Among them stood a 14-year-old girl named Wu. She was not the fairest. Some girls' skin shone like porcelain under moonlight. Others had the kind of curves that made men stumble. Wu was different. Her beauty was understated, but her eyes were sharp. They moved like blades across the courtyard, studying every rival, every gesture, every chance of survival. Where the other girls wept silently into their sleeves, Wu stood utterly still, her back straight, her face calm. Her family's rise had been sudden, violent, and improbable. Wu's father had once been nothing more than a merchant, a dealer in timber, horses, and silk. But he gambled everything on the right side during China's bloodiest civil war. He bet his fortune and his life on the rebel warlord who would soon become Emperor Taizong, one of the greatest rulers of the Tang dynasty. When Taizong seized power, Wu's family was rewarded. Overnight, they rose from traders to nobility. Her mother's bloodline traced back to the very dynasty Taizong had overthrown, a conquered lineage still whispered about in hushed reverence. This heritage gave Wu a dangerous edge, the mingling of new wealth and old blood, enough to make her a candidate for the emperor's harem, enough to place her inside the palace, a golden cage where thousands of women fluttered like jeweled birds, desperate for a single glance from the emperor. But unlike those jeweled birds, Wu was not content to sing. She entered the palace as a fifth-rank concubine, a status so low she was practically invisible. Fifth-rank concubines were expected to decorate themselves in silk, embroider poems onto cloth, and wait patiently for the emperor's desire. Few were ever noticed. Fewer still survived the poisonous rivalries of palace women. For most, the harem was less a home than a battlefield, silent but deadly, where smiles masked daggers and whispers carried as much weight as swords. Wu saw this world for what it was, a prison gilded in jade. Yet even prisons have libraries, and in those libraries, Wu found her weapon. While other concubines gossiped, embroidered, or schemed for a night in the imperial bed, Wu devoured books. She prowled the palace library like a predator in velvet halls, pulling down scrolls of military strategy, histories of dynasties long dead, and treatises on governance and law. She memorized campaigns of famous generals, traced the logic of legal codes, and absorbed the rhythms of poetry and philosophy. She did not learn to please a man. She learned to rule them, and she studied not only the books, but the people. Servants, eunuchs, guards. Wu remembered every face, every whispered rumor, every glance of fear or desire. In a world where information was currency, she was already saving for the future. Years passed, and though Wu was rarely summoned to the emperor's bed, she was summoned for something else. Taizong discovered that the quiet concubine wrote with an elegance and clarity his own ministers could not match. She could draft letters, summarize reports, even correct the errors of senior officials. To the old emperor, she was useful. To Wu, this was more than duty. It was training. 10 years crept by. She remained untouched, unwanted as a woman, but invaluable as a mind that sharpened itself in silence, preparing for the moment when opportunity would finally arrive. And then one day, opportunity walked into the emperor's study. He was 23 years old, gentle-faced, with hands as soft as silk, hands that had never known true hardship. His name was Li Ji, crown prince of the Tang dynasty. And when his kind eyes fell upon Wu, hunched over a scroll, something electric filled the air. The prince saw in her what no one else dared to notice, a woman brilliant, trapped, and burning with potential. Wu saw something else, opportunity draped in royal robes. And in that instant, her path shifted. What had begun as survival would soon transform into something far greater. For Wu understood the lesson every predator learns. When prey wanders too close, you don't wait. You strike. The emperor's study smelled of ink and sandalwood. Scrolls lay in neat stacks. Maps stretched across lacquered tables. And there, in the midst of it all, Wu bent over a document, her brush gliding with precision. She was the emperor's secretary now, chosen not for beauty, but for a talent sharper than any blade. Her writing was crisp, her memory flawless, her presence indispensable. The old emperor, Taizong, trusted her enough to let her handle state business, something no concubine had ever done. Ministers sneered behind closed doors, but none dared protest. Wu's place in the palace was changing. She was no longer an invisible concubine. She was becoming a shadow within the machinery of empire. And then came the prince. Li Ji entered one afternoon, the weight of inheritance heavy on his shoulders. He was gentle where his father was fierce, thoughtful where his father was calculating. His eyes softened as they fell on Wu, her face illuminated by the pale light of the study. For the first time in years, Wu felt eyes upon her, not with scorn, but with curiosity. Their first conversations were harmless. Reports, calligraphy, the small courtesies of palace life. But beneath the words was an unspoken recognition. The prince saw a woman who was intelligent, capable, alive. Wu saw a man who was vulnerable, destined for power, and already half hers. The old emperor himself seemed to sense Wu's hidden ferocity. One day, he turned to her with a question, a test meant to probe the steel of her character. "What would you do," he asked, "with a wild horse that refuses to be tamed?" The room went still. Ministers shifted uncomfortably, waiting for the girl to flounder. But Wu's reply cut through the silence like a blade. "First, I would beat it with an iron whip. If that fails, I would smash its skull with an iron mace. And if that too fails, I would slit its throat with a dagger." For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then the emperor erupted in laughter, delighted by her ruthlessness. The ministers exhaled in nervous relief, but one man did not laugh: the crown prince. His gentle face froze in horrified fascination as he realized the truth. Behind Wu's calm beauty lay a mind as merciless as it was brilliant. That night, he came to her quarters. At first, it was whispers, the trembling of hands brushing against silk. A dangerous game played in shadows, for discovery meant death. But the risk only heightened the fire. In hidden gardens where nightingales sang, in forgotten storerooms thick with dust, even in the emperor's own study while he slept nearby, the prince and Wu risked everything. But make no mistake, Wu's affair was never merely passion. Every kiss was calculated, every caress an investment. While the prince traced her skin with trembling fingers, Wu traced the weaknesses of his soul. She listened to his fears, memorized his doubts, catalogued his desires. To him, she was comfort and fire. To her, he was a door that led directly to the throne. "My father thinks women are ornaments," the prince confessed one night, his voice muffled against her shoulder. "Then we'll show him how wrong he is," Wu murmured, her lips curling with something between a smile and a promise. By day, she remained the emperor's secretary, guiding his hand in matters of state, carefully sliding her own ideas into policy, while he remained blissfully unaware. By night, she ruled the heir to the empire from her bed, turning whispered poetry into binding chains. The danger was intoxicating. Every moment could have been her last. One jealous rival, one careless slip, and she would be dragged in chains to the execution ground. Yet Wu thrived in the razor's edge of danger. The closer she danced to destruction, the sharper her mind became. And then, a shift, a swelling in her body, secret, silent, hidden beneath flowing robes. Life quickened within her. Not just any life, the life of the empire's future. The perfect opportunity was forming in her womb. Under the silver blade of a moon, Wu crept through corridors, heavy with the perfume of night-blooming jasmine. Guards slept at their posts. The prince waited in shadows, torn between terror and desire. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered. "Neither should you," she breathed, already knowing she owned him completely. It was no longer an affair. It was destiny. The woman the world had overlooked was about to rewrite it. With ink, with flesh, and with blood. The palace was alive with whispers. Servants carried trays of jade cups and silk robes, Eunuchs hurried down corridors with scrolls clutched to their chests, and behind every curtain, secrets bloomed like poisonous flowers. But in Wu's chamber, a deeper secret was taking shape, one that could shatter dynasties. Her belly swelled slowly, carefully hidden beneath loose robes and deliberate positioning. No one could know. For a concubine to bear the child of the crown prince while the emperor still lived was treason, punishable by death. But Wu was not afraid. She had already calculated the risks. Every stroke of her brush in the emperor's study, every whispered night with Li Ji, had led to this moment. She would not waste it. Then, fate intervened. The old Emperor Taizong, whose strength had once carved empires, began to fail. His body weakened, his once sharp eyes dulled, and soon the inevitable came. Taizong died, leaving his son Li Ji as the new emperor of China. Tradition demanded that all concubines of the dead emperor be sent to Buddhist monasteries, condemned to a living death in prayer and silence. For Wu, exile was a sentence worse than execution. She was to vanish behind temple walls, her ambition buried beneath layers of dust and incense. But Wu was never one to accept the fate handed to her. By then, the new emperor could not forget her. His nights were haunted by her touch, his mind filled with her brilliance. And Wu had one more weapon hidden, the child she carried. She was no longer just a discarded concubine. She was the vessel of his bloodline. In secrecy, she was smuggled back into the palace. Officially, she returned under the guise of religious consultation, a grieving son seeking spiritual comfort from a nun. In truth, it was a lover's desperate gamble, and Wu's triumphant re-entry into the world she refused to leave. The birth was hidden from the world. Behind heavily guarded doors, in chambers attended only by her most trusted servants, Wu gave life to a daughter. The infant's cries pierced the silence, fragile but insistent, like the toll of a distant bell. For Wu, holding the child was both revelation and calculation. The baby's skin was soft as rose petals, her tiny hands curling around Wu's finger with innocent strength. But Wu did not see merely a child. She saw a weapon. The court was told a convenient fiction, that Wu had conceived only after her return, proof of divine favor and fertility. The barren empress, after years of failure, looked suddenly weak by comparison. Wu's body, fertile and victorious, was the future. It was a dangerous triumph. For in the palace, nothing was more lethal than envy. The empress's golden palanquin often passed near the nursery. She had no child of her own, yet here was a baby, the emperor's blood, the empire's hope, resting in the arms of a rival. Servants whispered that the empress would not tolerate the insult. Wu cradled her daughter in the dim candlelight, feeling the child's heartbeat flutter against her chest. Outside, autumn leaves rustled like brittle parchment. She kissed the baby's forehead, eyes dark with thought. To others, this child was a blessing. To Wu, she was a blade sharpened for the perfect strike. And soon, Wu would wield her. The nursery was quiet that evening, heavy with the faint perfume of sandalwood and the rustle of silk curtains. Wu sat in silence, her daughter swaddled against her chest, the child's breath rising and falling like the fragile wings of a moth. Outside, servants bustled in distant courtyards, unaware that within this room, history's most terrible decision was about to be made. Wu had been preparing for weeks. Subtle suggestions whispered into servants' ears, timed comments about the baby's first smile, carefully placed hints that would drift, as intended, to the empress herself. A barren woman, desperate for legitimacy, jealous of the rival who had succeeded where she had failed. When word of the baby's charm reached her, the empress's curiosity was irresistible. Wu knew she would come. The moment arrived. The Empress's golden palanquin was seen leaving her residence, carried toward the nursery. Wu's pulse quickened, not with fear, but with precision. She had calculated every detail. This was not chance. It was design. As the baby cooed softly, Wu's face hardened. The child's innocence, her tiny hands curled like pink seashells, made the task monstrous. But Wu was not a woman to flinch. She was a woman who had trained herself to do what others could not. She laid the baby gently upon silken sheets and lowered a small embroidered pillow over the child's face. For a moment, there was resistance, the weak fluttering of limbs, the muffled cry. Wu pressed down, steady, unrelenting, until the body beneath her stilled. The redness around the infant's nose and mouth, the marks of suffocation, would look to the world like evidence of murder. But not Wu's murder. When she pulled the pillow away, her hands trembled, not from grief, but from the enormity of what she had just done. She had killed her own daughter, not for hatred, not for desperation, but for power. Her screams split the palace like the cry of a wounded animal. Servants rushed in to find Wu collapsed over the child's lifeless body, her makeup streaked with tears. The performance was perfect. She clutched the baby and wailed, her words tumbling out between sobs. The Empress was here. She touched my child. And now my daughter is dead. The Emperor burst into the chamber, his face pale with shock. For years he had grown weary of his childless wife, resentful of her failures. Now his worst suspicions seemed confirmed. He saw his infant daughter dead in Wu's arms, and the woman he had married accused of a crime unthinkable. The witch killed my child, Wu whispered through choking sobs, her anguish flawless, her voice breaking with just the right mix of grief and rage. She couldn't bear to see me happy when she has given you nothing. The Emperor's hands shook as fury consumed him. The gentle Prince Wu had once seduced was gone. In his place stood a grieving father blinded by rage. Orders were shouted, guards thundered into the Empress's quarters, and by morning, the Barren Empress was under arrest. The court was stunned. Whispers spread like wildfire. Ministers muttered of divine judgment. Eunuchs spoke of betrayal, and concubines clutched their own children tighter, terrified of what might come next. But no one dared challenge the story. The official narrative was set. The Empress, crazed with envy, had murdered the Emperor's only child. And Wu, grieving, fertile, wronged, emerged not broken, but exalted. Yet beneath her tears, something colder glimmered. As she held the child's still body, Wu's thoughts were not of loss, but of triumph. Her daughter had been a pawn, sacrificed for a queen's gambit, and the gamble had paid off. Within months, the Empress was deposed. Wu was crowned in her place, adorned with the phoenix crown that had once been out of reach. The throne was hers, and all it had cost was the breath of an infant who would never grow old. For the rest of her life, historians would argue whether Wu truly smothered her daughter or merely exploited a natural death at the perfect moment. But the truth mattered little. What mattered was power. And Wu now wore it like armor. The price had been unthinkable, but Wu had already discovered the intoxicating truth of rule. Once you taste power, there is nothing you will not do to keep it. With the Empress gone and Wu crowned in her place, the palace seemed to settle into uneasy silence. But beneath that silence, something had changed forever. Wu was no longer an overlooked concubine, nor a grieving mother. She was Empress of China, and she intended to rule not as an ornament at her husband's side, but as the hand that guided the empire. The Emperor, Li Ji, adored her. His devotion bordered on obsession, and Wu knew how to wield that love like a sword. While he appeared at ceremonies and signed decrees, she became his voice, his memory, his will. And when illness began to eat away at his body, mysterious strokes that left him slurring, drooling, unable to command. Wu slipped seamlessly into the role of shadow sovereign. She was dutiful in appearance, the perfect wife tending to her ailing husband. But every order that passed through the palace now bore her seal, not his. Ministers who dared resist her influence were suddenly charged with corruption. Princes who questioned her decisions suffered sudden accidents. Entire bloodlines vanished overnight, erased from the empire's memory with the stroke of her brush. Wu learned the art of purges quickly. Every dynasty before her had bathed in blood to survive. She was no different. But her genius lay in how she cloaked brutality in necessity. Enemies did not vanish because of personal vengeance. They vanished because the empire required it. At least, that was the story the records told. Still, absolute power has a cost. And with power came loneliness. Surrounded by trembling ministers and fearful concubines, Wu found herself restless. She longed for something raw, something beyond the suffocating rituals of court. And one day, while riding in a curtained carriage through the crowded markets of Chang'an, she found it. He was a street peddler, massive and crude, with arms glistening in the summer heat as he shouted over the crowd. He arm-wrestled soldiers, laughed with prostitutes, and sold trinkets with a voice that carried like thunder. He was everything the polished world of the palace was not: untamed, dangerous, alive. Wu watched him from behind silk curtains, her pulse quickening. She wanted him. But how could the Empress of China, embodiment of order and divine authority, openly take a commoner as her lover? Such a scandal would arm her enemies and unravel her throne. Her solution was brilliantly twisted. The man's head was shaved, his coarse clothing replaced with saffron robes. He was reborn not as a street thug, but as a Buddhist monk. Monks, after all, could enter the palace freely under the guise of conducting rituals. And what they did behind closed doors was between them and the Buddha. That night, when he entered her chambers, his passion nearly splintered the carved furniture. Wu discovered in him not just a lover, but a force of nature, a man who worshipped her body with the same abandon he once used to hawk trinkets in the street. She indulged, but she also schemed. For Wu never allowed intimacy without utility. Within months, the monk was no longer just a lover. He became a weapon. She gave him commands, placed him in charge of armies and construction projects. Ministers accustomed to centuries of noble hierarchy now found themselves bowing before a man who just months earlier had hawked cheap goods in the market. The sight was electrifying. It was also terrifying. Her own nephews, sons of noble families, were forced to kneel before him, their faces burning with humiliation as they kissed the ground at his feet. Court officials, men who had studied the Confucian classics their entire lives, were forced to obey the orders of a former street seller. The message was clear. Power did not come from bloodlines or scholarship. Power came from Wu and from her bed. The scandal shook the empire. Ministers whispered of chaos, of the collapse of moral order. Foreign emissaries carried home stories that sounded like madness. An empress who elevated her lovers to the rank of princes, who turned monks into generals, who played with power as if it were a game of chance. But Wu reveled in it. By proving she could raise anyone, even the lowest born, above the most ancient aristocrats, she shattered the traditional order. The palace was hers to command, and her desires were law. Yet even weapons can become dangerous when they forget who forged them. The monk's ego grew monstrous, his appetites uncontrollable. When Wu turned her attention to a new lover, a refined young physician whose elegance contrasted the monk's brutality, jealousy consumed him. In a fit of rage, he set fire to one of the empire's most sacred buildings, reducing years of construction and millions in treasure to ash. Wu's response was swift and merciless. The same woman who had once lifted him from filth now consigned him back to it. Guards found his massive body sprawled across the floor, his lips purple from poison. His rise had been meteoric. His fall was final. Wu's lesson was simple. Her favor could elevate a man to the clouds, but the moment he became a liability, she could just as easily hurl him back to the dirt. And yet, the experiment had revealed something intoxicating. Lovers were not just distractions. They were tools, living symbols of her absolute dominance. One lover was scandal. Two lovers were strategy. What came next would make the monk's rise look like a child's game. For Wu was about to discover a pair of men whose beauty and influence would push her reign into both ecstasy and disaster. The Brothers of Moonlight were waiting. By the time Wu Zetian reached her 70s, she was already a figure both feared and worshipped. She had crushed rivals, reigned in her husband's stead, and then in her own name. She had outlived plots, rebellions, and dynastic expectations. Yet with the empire at her feet, Wu discovered a truth that haunted every ruler. Power cannot stop time. Her body sagged, her beauty faded, and age wrapped itself around her like a shroud. But desire never faded. It was then that two young men entered her court. They were brothers, their beauty so luminous that ministers whispered they looked like figures carved from moonlight and ivory. Their names were Zhang Yizhi and Zhang Changzong. They were in their 20s, untouched by the lines of age. Their faces so symmetrical, so unnaturally perfect, that hardened warriors stared as though struck dumb. Wu's heart, that of a 70-year-old empress, skipped like a girl's. She wanted them both. The brothers were presented as advisors, recommended through a niece who understood her aunt's hunger. Wu saw through the pretense immediately. These men were not brought to guide policy. They were brought as offerings, living tributes to satisfy an empress who had everything except youth. Within weeks, the Zhang brothers moved into chambers beside her own. The transformation was immediate. They were not merely lovers. Wu turned them into living dolls. Each morning, servants painted their faces with rouge, traced their eyes with kohl, and stained their lips crimson until they glowed like ethereal courtesans. Their robes blazed in emerald, scarlet, and royal purple, embroidered with phoenixes and dragons. Jewels dangled from their ears, pearls glistened in their hair. Men in makeup, men dressed in silks finer than any woman of the court, men adored by the most powerful woman alive. It was an inversion so profound, it shocked the empire to its core. In a world where women were meant to be submissive and men austere, Wu had rewritten the script. She paraded the brothers through the palace like peacocks, seating them at her throne during councils. Ambassadors watched, slack-jawed, as the empress was fed grapes by painted boys, while matters of state unfolded before them. At banquets, one brother played the flute, dressed as a mythical prince. The other fanned her with peacock feathers, his smile dazzling and surreal. And behind the scenes, the brothers did more than play dress-up. They ruled. No audience with the empress was granted without their approval. Ministers who wanted promotion bribed them with jewels, silk, or humiliating favors. High offices were sold like trinkets in a market stall. Governors, generals, chancellors. Their fates depended not on merit, but on the whim of two beautiful men who had never commanded a sword nor governed a province. Officials who resisted were mocked, excluded, or ruined. One chancellor from an ancient family was forced, at Wu's command, to debase himself by bedding the Zhang brothers' elderly mother, a grotesque humiliation designed to prove no one, not even the highest born, was safe from her perverse reordering of power. The court was aghast. Yet, Wu, besotted, could not see the abyss she was creating. Her obsession deepened into madness. She showered the brothers with titles. One named a duke, the other given military commands, though he could barely hold a blade. She built them mansions, gifted them servants, lavished them with treasures that bankrupted the treasury. But the worst came when criticism arose from within her own family. Her grandchildren, heirs of the dynasty, whispered the truth everyone feared to say aloud: that the Zhang brothers had corrupted the throne, that their grandmother's obsession was dragging China into ruin. Wu's response was merciless. She forced them to commit suicide, their young lives extinguished for daring to speak against her lovers. In that moment, she crossed a line even her loyalists could no longer ignore. The empire reeled. Ministers whispered in shadows. Foreign emissaries sent home reports of surreal decadence. And the people began to speak of their empress not as a ruler, but as a madwoman enslaved by beauty. And still, Wu clung to them. At 75, she sat on the throne with glassy eyes, her wrinkled hands caressing painted cheeks, her voice calling them my sons, my gods, my immortals. The empire crumbled under their games, dice gambles that forced ministers to crawl on their bellies, grotesque performances where the brothers mocked dead emperors in drunken falsetto, while Wu laughed until her painted face cracked. The palace had become a carnival, a brothel masquerading as a court, and beyond the crimson walls, in hidden chambers and shadow corridors, men began to plot. For beauty may dazzle, it may terrify, but even beauty can bleed. The palace at night was never truly silent. Wind rattled paper lanterns, guards' boots echoed on flagstones, and from distant halls came the muffled sound of laughter and music. But on one February evening in the year 705, the air grew heavier, colder, charged with something unspoken. In a forgotten storeroom beneath the palace, 5 old men gathered around a single flickering candle. Their faces, carved by decades of fear and humiliation, glowed with a resolve long suppressed. They had watched their empire transformed into a stage for painted boys and drunken games. They had bowed to the Zhang brothers, men who mocked sacred rituals and reduced the dynasty's majesty to farce. They had endured the empress's tyranny, her purges, her sacrifices. But now, at the edge of their patience, they had reached a single conclusion. The empire would not survive unless Wu's creatures were destroyed. "The brothers sleep in the east wing," whispered the eldest conspirator, his voice steady despite his shaking hands. "Strike them first. Without them, she is nothing." Above them, in Wu's private chamber, the scene could not have been more obscene. At 75, her body sagged beneath painted silk, yet she lay flanked by her 2 radiant lovers. One whispered poetry into her ear, tracing trembling fingers across her withered chest. The other fed her dates soaked in wine, calling her a goddess reborn. She giggled like a girl, her powdered face cracking with every smile. None of them heard the footsteps. The conspirators moved like ghosts, their blades already drawn. The bedroom door crashed open. The elder Zhang brother turned, his painted lips parting in surprise, only to have his throat opened by steel. Blood sprayed across the silk curtains as he collapsed, his perfect face twisted in terror. The younger tried to flee, but was thrown to the ground. A dagger plunged again and again into his ribs until he lay twitching in silence. The empress froze. For the first time in decades, she was powerless, her gods reduced to butchered corpses at her feet. "My sons!" she wailed, her voice cracking into hysteria. "My beautiful sons!" "They were whores," spat one conspirator, his blade still dripping. "And you turned our empire into their brothel." Wu's breakdown was immediate. The woman who had murdered Riles without hesitation now collapsed into sobs. Guards, once eager to defend her, stood aside. They too had grown sick of the carnival she had created. No one lifted a hand to stop the conspirators as they dragged the sobbing empress from her chamber, her robes soaked in her lover's blood. By dawn, the Zhang brothers' mutilated bodies were displayed in the palace courtyard, a grim warning to anyone who dared confuse beauty with authority. Wu herself was stripped of power. Her son, long overshadowed, was placed back upon the throne. The empire exhaled, as though awakening from a fever. Wu was not executed. Instead, she was confined to a palace-turned-prison, a golden cage now emptied of laughter, lovers, and power. Ministers who once groveled before her refused even to speak her name. Servants whispered mockery where once they had trembled. Alone in echoing chambers, Wu stared into mirrors that reflected nothing but sagging flesh and painted cracks, the ruin of what once had been called divine. Meals turned to ash in her mouth. Her hands shook when lifting a cup. The silence was worse than death. 10 months later, on December 16th, 705, Wu Zetian died in her prison palace. No weeping crowds, no songs of mourning, only a final request, that her tomb be marked with a blank stone. No inscriptions, no boasts, no carved records of her reign. Just smooth granite, watching history in silence. When asked why, she left only a riddle. Let future generations judge me. That stone still stands today, the only wordless imperial monument in 3,000 years of Chinese history. And history has judged. Male emperors who kept harems of 10,000 concubines are remembered as vigorous and strong. Wu, who had perhaps a dozen lovers across half a century, is branded a deviant who corrupted an empire. Her purges, no bloodier than those of her male counterparts, are painted as monstrous excess. Her reforms, often revolutionary, are overshadowed by scandal, but modern historians see differently. Wu expanded China's borders farther than any Tang ruler. She reformed the civil service, opening government posts to commoners through examinations rather than aristocratic birth. Trade boomed. Agriculture flourished. The empire's coffers overflowed. She was ruthless, yes, but brilliant. A woman who bent a world designed to erase her into submission. Perhaps that blank stone is not silence, but defiance. A refusal to let her enemies write her story. A challenge cast across centuries. Judge me by what I built, not by what frightened you about a woman who refused to obey. Wu Zetian, the Blood Empress, monster, visionary, victim of prejudice, or all three. Even in death, she remains impossible to ignore.